Okay, 75 feet. Car's looking good. Down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on. Forward. Forward. 40 feet. Down 2.5. Picking up some dust. Straight shadow. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. 30 seconds. Forward. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
The Apollo space missions weren't just a triumph of engineering. They were a masterclass in storytelling and marketing. In the 1960s, NASA didn't merely launch rockets, it captured imaginations, weaving a narrative of human exploration, courage, and possibility. At its core was the story of humanity reaching for the stars, a powerful counterpoint to Cold War tensions. From President Kennedy's iconic call to action, "We choose to go to the moon," to the meticulously crafted broadcasts from space. Apollo was as much about winning hearts and minds as it was about science. By framing the missions as a collective human endeavor, NASA turned a technical feat into a cultural milestone, proving that even the greatest leaps forward require a compelling story to inspire the world. Welcome to Season 9 of The Great Indoors, where we explore the transformative role of storytelling in an era of generative AI. As technology shapes our culture and products, the risk of homogeneity looms large. This season will discuss how embracing unique narratives can counterbalance AI's influence, ensuring our stories retain depth, authenticity, and originality. Join us as we champion the human voice in the digital age. I'm your host, Matthew Roberts, and as ever, I'm joined by my producer, the one and only Larissa Yee. So we continue in this season to dive into the evolving power of storytelling. And it's a privilege to welcome back to the Great Indoors today, Mr. David Meerman Scott. Now, for those of you that don't know David, he is a true pioneer in modern marketing and storytelling. As a best-selling author, speaker, and strategist, David has transformed the way we think about connecting with audiences. His seminal book, The New Rules of Marketing and PR, redefined how organizations build relationships in the digital age, and his co-authored work, Fanocracy, explores the power of turning customers into passionate fans. Very much the motivation for this particular podcast. Among his many other contributions, the book Marketing the Moon stands out as a brilliant account of NASA's groundbreaking use of storytelling and public relations during the Apollo missions. A narrative so compelling, it inspired the recent movie Fly Me to the Moon, featuring Channing Tatum and Scarlett Johansson. David's work continues to shape the future of marketing, offering profound insights into the art of human connection. So I'd like to welcome Mr. David Meerman Scott. So welcome back to the Great Indoors. We've got quite an episode lined up for you today, and I'm really excited to introduce a former guest of the Great Indoors. He was way back in season 3, I think it was. I'm a huge fan, so I'm really excited to record today with the one and only Mr. David Meerman Scott. Welcome back, David.
Thanks, Matt. It's so good to be back here. I love having conversations with you.
Excellent, and likewise. And before we get into everything we're going to discuss today, where are you in the world today, and how is it going there?
Going great, actually. I'm outside of Boston, so not too far away from you, actually. And it is a beautiful day. We've had the most amazing autumn, just unbelievable, warm, not much rain. So I don't know what that foretells for the winter, but it's all good.
Right. No, it's been the same here. And exactly, winter is coming. As
yes.
They say, winter is coming. Now, when we did our pre-chat on this, David, our little pre-brief before we got into the discussion, it sounds like some pretty amazing things have been going on in your world since we last spoke. So for our listeners, What's been happening the last couple of years? It sounds really incredible.
Last couple of years have been really interesting because I had been doing 30 or 40 paid speaking gigs a year all over the world. It's been obviously done a few for you as well. And then all of a sudden COVID hit. Oh my gosh, what do we do now? And so I kind of reevaluated who I am and what I am because I was on an airplane almost every week. And, all of a sudden I wasn't on an airplane at all. So I built this home studio so I can still do presentations and podcasts and whatnot from my home. But I really started to think about what are the things that are important to me. And one thing I did very recently, a couple months ago, as we're recording this, is I took a sabbatical for the first time in my entire life. I took a month off and I hiked the entire long trail, which is the opposite of the great indoors. It's the great outdoors, and it's 273 miles, the length of Vermont from the Quebec border down to the Massachusetts border, 68,000 vertical feet elevation change, which is 2.5 times Mount Everest, roughly. And I camped the whole way, 26 days. And it was a remarkable thing because I've dug in deep to artificial intelligence. I've dug in deep to new ways to do marketing. I've dug in deep to a number of different things on the business front. But this allowed me to really step away. And I tried to avoid my phone for as much as that time as I could. And really just kind of almost reboot. And it was a fabulous experience.
Wow, therapeutic.
Yeah, it really was. In so many interesting ways to just encounter completely different people, be out in the wilderness, be out of cell phone coverage. It was wonderful.
Awesome. Now, you also mentioned to me that a book that you wrote about 10 years ago, Marketing the Moon, something big happened with that, right?
Something big did happen. So here's Marketing the Moon. It's about the Apollo Lunar Program, the marketing and public relations aspect of the Apollo Lunar Program. And I've been a huge fan of the Apollo program since I was a kid. I was 8 years old when we first landed on the moon and walked on the moon. And that was like the most amazing, fascinating thing for me at that age. And I have kept that fascination for a really long time and built a collection of artifacts from the Apollo Lunar Program, had a chance to meet and interact with more than half of the men who walked on the surface of the moon, and really dug in deep into the research of how and why did we, meaning Americans, decide to spend 2% of our national budget over an entire decade to put 12 humans on the surface of the moon. What a crazy, audacious, nutty thing we did. Looking at it 55 years later, it's surreal that we did it. Why did we do it? And so I looked at the marketing aspects, and it turns out that there were some really smart people in NASA and some really smart people in the contractors that served NASA, Boeing and Raytheon and IBM and North American Rockwell, all these companies that built aspects of the Apollo spacecraft and other items that the astronauts used, Omega watches, for example, Stouffer Foods, for example, and all of the marketing people in those companies contributed to this effort to convince the American people that this was a worthwhile project. And the book came out, as you mentioned, 10 years ago. It did well. MIT Press published it. It's a coffee table sort of color illustrated book. And one of the books I wrote, I've written 12, and it was, a real special kind of book, different kind of book than I've written. But then about 6 months ago, I saw a movie trailer for a film called Fly Me to the Moon. And I watched it. I was like, oh my gosh, they had to have read my book. The film stars Scarlett Johansson and Channing Tatum and Woody Harrelson. And it's a comedy about the marketing aspects of the Apollo Lunar Program. And so I knew that they had to have, even just from the 1 minute trailer, 90-second trailer, I knew they had to have consulted my book. And so then as the movie was launching, the week that it released, that's when movies get the most press, is the week it released. The filmmakers and the script writer gave us credit in interviews in magazines and newspapers and on television and whatnot, and said, yeah, we extensively worked with this book called Marketing the Moon. Now, I didn't get into royalties. They didn't have to acquire the rights because my book is nonfiction. It's a historical account of what happened. And then the script writers used my historical account of what happened to craft a narrative that was rooted in reality, but it was a completely made up fictional narrative. So it's not like they did not legally have to license my work, which is fine because they did end up giving us public credit, which was great. And I went to the movie I think it was the second day that it was out, and it was super fun to watch. And had some social media interaction with the script writer who thanked me for writing the book. So, but I mean, it was super exciting because as a writer of marketing books, the last thing on your mind is that there'll be a movie made out of it. and in fact, that's the second movie that was made on this book, made as a result of this book. The first one was a nonfiction documentary about the Apollo Lunar Program. And I did have an agreement in place with the filmmaker, his name is Robert Stone, for a 3-part American Experience PBS miniseries called Chasing the Moon that came out at the 50th anniversary of the Apollo lunar landings, the first Apollo lunar landings, Apollo 11, and that was based on the book too. So not only one, but 2 movies based on a marketing book. Go figure.
No, and I need to break this to you, David. I hear Ridley Scott is looking at producing a motion picture around Fanocracy.
There we go.
Yeah. He's casting as we speak, I believe. But I think it's wonderful. And I watched the movie after we spoke.
Oh, you did? Yeah.
Me and my wife. Yeah, it's a great movie. And me and my wife, and Larissa will testify, I've tasked the entire team to watch this movie because I think there's 2 aspects to it that lend itself beautifully to our discussion. Not only is the moon landings just an incredible milestone in mankind, in history, particularly if you work in technology. The amount of technology to get to the moon is outstanding. And as I told you, I was lucky enough to visit Houston earlier this year and sit through a recreation in Mission Control, and it blew my mind. But I think there's 2 things. Not only is it an incredible story, but like you said, the script writers took your marketing book and turned it into a story, which accentuates the power of everything that even happened. So that's one point. But the second point, and this is the point I want to start off and dive into, was the marketing angle. Because at the time they brought in the key marketeer from, I don't remember the name of the Scarlett Johansson character, who was the number 1 marketeer in the US, NASA was going through a serious negative image and perception amongst the people, amongst the citizens of the US. And like you said, they were spending 2% of GDP to do this mission. So they had to bring in some marketeer to change the image and the perception. Do you think that in this technological age with the big corporates that suffer from ups and downs, and we've talked about them on this podcast in the past, are there lessons for corporate marketeers in that story with NASA 50 years ago?
Absolutely there is. 100% there is. So many of them, as a matter of fact. So putting aside for a moment the fictional account of what happened, and the bits about faking the lunar landing and all that are in the fictional movie, but the real aspect of what NASA and the contractors did was remarkable. So for the first thing they did was they made the astronauts into heroes. They were the heroic figures, who are going to risk their life to travel to another planet, the surface of the moon. And this was something that no one had really thought of doing before. Before that, the astronauts were not portrayed as heroes. but they were they got contracts with Life magazine to be the exclusive sort of biographer of their personal stories, and then the other thing I found, a couple of other things I found fascinating was that NASA chose to make it a completely open program, the Apollo program. Prior to the manned missions, everything NASA was doing was secretive. It was like the missile programs, it was they were keeping everything quiet. And the Russian program was completely quiet all the way through the 1960s. They did not talk about it. They didn't even mention that there was going to be a space mission until it was safely on the ground again. Whereas NASA said, all right, let's make it completely public. And to the point where NASA said, and this is a pretty controversial thing, we're going to put live color television on the surface of the moon. And most people said, what are you talking about? We don't have the technology. At that time, a TV camera was an enormous 300-pound thing on a big fat tripod that had to be tethered with a big cable to a control center. How in the world are you going to bring that into space and land it on the moon and bring live color television to Americans? And they spent a lot of money figuring that out. Millions and millions of dollars had to figure out how to get a camera small enough and light enough and the technology to beam from the moon to the earth that color television, because they recognized that that was essential for the marketing aspect. Telling the story of being on the moon required Americans to be able to actually see it in real time. That was a radical thing to want to do. And many people in NASA, including some of the astronauts, said, no, we don't want to do that. We're not actors. We're on a mission here. We don't need to be distracted by television. But a few of the astronauts and a few people in the public relations department of NASA said, this is a really important thing to do, and we ought to do it. So it was actually a content marketing story. And it was a story of making heroes out of people. And I think every corporation can learn from that. Who in your organization can you make a hero? And maybe you don't use that word, but is there a product designer somewhere that can come out from behind the closet and be a spokesperson for you, the way that the astronauts became, reluctantly for most of them, spokespeople for the Apollo program? And can you find content that you can create, like NASA did with insisting that color television be delivered from the surface of the moon, even though it was an enormous technical problem?
If we look at modern corporate life, what NASA did back then is it turned people into heroes. And, corporations could turn their CMOs, their CEOs into heroes. And they were very transparent and open with the public with what they were doing. And that's a corporate lesson. And the third thing was, and we take this for granted, but they embraced a new medium that wasn't even at the 90% penetration rate that you see with, televisions and live streaming and even mobile devices. So if you take that story and apply it to modern corporate life, embracing new mediums like social media as a proponent to that content, making the key protagonists heroes, and being open and transparent. There's just 3 killer corporate marketing messages from 50 years ago, right?
100%. And there are others. We could spend the entire discussion talking about the Apollo Lunar Program marketing aspects. But and so I call it the most important marketing case study in history. And fortunately, I dug in deep and wrote a book about it. And I can't tell you how many people thanked me for doing that book. People, for example, the reporters who covered the Apollo Lunar Program, who we wrote about in the book, thank you for talking about how our role as reporters was important. The public relations people, thank you for sharing how important this was. We spent a day with with Jack King. Jack was the head of public affairs at Kennedy Space Center. He's the gentleman who actually did the 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, all systems go, 5, 4, 3, all engines running, liftoff. We have liftoff of Apollo 11. That's Jack King. I interviewed him in the last, I think, the last month of his life, or at least, or maybe a month. He had 2 months to live or something. He knew he was not going to live much longer. It was very important for him to tell that story for our film, for Chasing the Moon, the documentary. And he agreed, even though he was quite sick, to be interviewed. And we had him do a countdown for us. And I just got chills. I got chills sitting in a little hotel room, talking to him about Apollo. And then he said to us, "You're the first person who recognized how important our role was as public relations executives in the Apollo program. Sure, people have talked to me about the countdown before, but you're the first person to talk with us about this public relations aspect." And he was so proud of the book we wrote. And he sadly didn't have a chance to see the movie, but we learned from his daughter that he was really, really happy to have had a chance to be interviewed for the movie. So yeah, it was a great, great experience.
Now, you and I, as we discussed, are followers. When I went to Houston, I completely geeked out on everything I saw and sitting in mission control. So, for us, it's an instant appreciation and admiration of everything's going on. But then when it's turned into the movie, Fly Me to the Moon, how important was that story then? The narrative, all the pieces, the comedy, the humor, the love story elements in bringing the importance of that piece of history to a broader demographic, the storytelling aspect then.
Well, what's interesting to me is that, again, I mentioned I was 8 years old when Apollo 11 landed. So I lived through it and I remember it. It was a very important aspect of my life. But the vast majority of humans were not alive, who are alive now were not alive then. Or if they were alive, weren't old enough to remember it. So there's a whole group of people who don't know much about the Apollo Lunar Program, but who enjoy movies. So they had to do a lot of background storytelling to show what was going on at the time in the 1960s. They had to be very, very authentic, and I think they were. They did a great job of being authentic with what those places looked like in the 1960s, what people wore, how they talked, the hairstyles, right, the cars. It was really well done, and that allowed the filmmakers to then do the screwball comedy aspect of it, and also, as you mentioned, the love story and all that. But I think they did a brilliant job with that, and I think that they got the details right. I didn't see anything that I had written about in our book that they got wrong. They got all of those aspects right. So good for them. And so I think anybody can watch that movie and get a sense of what it was like. And yeah, you just need to have a little bit of disbelief, but we all have a little bit of disbelief while watching a fictional movie like.
No, and I think it's important in history and in education sometimes to have that more elaborate story that resonates with people, and then they remember it, you see. I'll give you an example, Titanic.
Yes,
right? So
good example. Yeah.
Titanic, it's ship left England, hit an iceberg, sank, a lot of people died, okay. And then my son watched the movie and became like a Titanic nerd, facts and figures, and it's propelled him into thinking about all sorts of different maritime history. But it was that story by James Cameron that captured his imagination and propelled him to think about other things in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think that similarly to Fly Me to the Moon, when I came back from Houston, I said to my wife, "Oh my gosh, I was at Mission Control. I sat there and they recreated everything, and there was still cigarettes on the desk from 1969. And she was like, okay, whatever. Then she watched Fly Me to the Moon and she said, that is incredible. So it brings it to a different audience, the importance of some of those historical things. And, this whole new season is about storytelling, David. And I want to go back to, I've got it here actually in my hand, Fanocracy, that Ridley Scott, like I said, is getting ready to.
The movie's coming. Exactly.
The movie's coming. Yeah, we're speaking with him. Let's go back to that notion, that concept, because that was very much something that has influenced and inspired this podcast. How does storytelling in association or in connection with Fanocracy become an important factor from a marketing perspective and even just from an educational perspective?
So the idea of Fanocracy, I wrote the book with my daughter, Reiko, and the idea was that she and I often would talk about what we're fans of. I am a huge fan of the Grateful Dead. I'm a huge fan, as we've talked about, of the Apollo Lunar Program. I like to surf. I consider myself a backpacker after my sabbatical hiking a long trail. These are the things I love. My daughter, Reiko, loves Korean pop music, K-pop. She loves Harry Potter. She's now 31. When we wrote the book, she was 24 when we started, about 26 or 27. I forget exactly when the book came out. So we came together to talk about this idea of how and why people become fans of something. And we even looked at the neuroscience aspect of it. Her undergraduate degree at Columbia University is in neuroscience. And we wanted to know what's going on in the brain when somebody becomes a fan. And it turns out, and this is really important, that all humans are hardwired to want to be part of a tribe of like-minded people. That's when we feel safe and comfortable. It's actually a survival technique, because tens of thousands of years ago, as we were small bands of roving humans in remote areas in Africa, let's say, we were safe and comfortable when we were with our tribe, and we were vulnerable if we weren't, and we were vulnerable if we encountered a tribe of other people who weren't part of our tribe. Tribes, whether it's the Grateful Dead tribe or the tribe of surfers or Harry Potter lovers, end up telling stories about their membership in that tribe. And there's, because you begin to learn the lore of that tribe that you're a part of, in some cases there's sort of secret, not secrets as in don't tell anyone, but secrets in that you've really got to dig in deep before you understand some of the nuances of what's happening. So I've been to 111 Grateful Dead concerts. I wrote a book called Marketing Lessons from the Grateful Dead. So I'm pretty deep into that world. And if I meet another Grateful Dead fan somewhere, we've got an instant connection. We've got an instant, we share the same stories. So what we wrote about in Fanocracy is ways that companies can use these ideas around storytelling, around building a tribe of like-minded people, about how they can create an environment which is conducive to building fans. And most organizations don't think that way, but the ones that do, in some cases, can do particularly well with it. And I find it just to be a fascinating concept. As a fan, and most of us are fans of something, fan of a sports team, fan of playing a sport, an activity like, I don't know, fly fishing or ballroom dancing or flower arranging or whatever it might be that you're a fan of. That's where your passion lies. That's where the stories that you like originate from. That's where the people that you like to interact with are also a part of that world. And organizations can cultivate that. But it's a different form of, call it marketing if you will, but it's a different form of marketing.
No, and I love the notion of fandom being good for business. If customers are part of your fandom, if they're a fan of what you do, then it's good for business, right? For all the reasons that you discuss in your book. Could the storyteller, and then you have your shared stories when you're part of that, Fanocracy that's shared, but could storytelling bring people into that Fanocracy? Could they hear the story like we talked about with Titanic or with the Apollo missions? That's what makes them a fan. That's what brings them into that circle of like-minded people. Could it be the storytelling is the beginning, the path, the journey to enter into that Fanocracy or into that group?
I think there's definitely a possibility of that. One of the stories within Fanocracy that I love is a story I tell often when I'm on the speaking circuit. It's about a company called Haggerty Insurance. So everybody hates insurance. And I actually ask people in my in-person presentations, raise your hand if you love car insurance. And there's no hands that go up. Why? Because you have to spend money to get car insurance. And it's terrible if you have to use the product because you've crashed your car. It's no fun to buy. There's a lot of reasons why car insurance is not a lovable product. Haggerty Insurance is a specialty insurance company. They do classic cars, typically over 25 years old. So they realized that they can't use the typical marketing strategy for insurance companies, especially car insurance companies, which is either be the cheapest or advertise the most. That's how most auto insurance companies operate. Be the lower cost provider or be the provider that you want to stick in people's minds and you advertise more. So what they did instead was they actually went out to tell the stories of classic car owners, classic car lovers, individual classic cars in such a way that those ideas would spread and that people would be excited about the idea of being a part of they call it the Haggerty Drivers Club. There's a YouTube channel with, last time I checked, it was I think it was certainly over 1 million subscribers. They have something like 1 million members of their drivers club. They did something remarkable with the data that they collected. So because they're insuring classic cars, they have data on how much classic cars cost because people insure their classic cars. I have a 1973 Land Rover, for example, and I know how much I insured it for. And then they aggregate all that data over the millions of cars that they insured to provide true valuations about how much these cars are worth. And so people tell stories about this car has gone up in value over the last 10 years, that car has not. They've actually cultivated storytelling around the passion of collecting and owning classic cars. But here's the thing. They're an insurance company. It doesn't directly tie to people saying, oh, you have the best data about cars, I'm going to buy insurance from you. Oh, you have a great YouTube channel, I'm going to buy insurance from you. Oh, you've got a drivers club that provides information for me, I'm going to buy insurance from you. That's not a direct line in the way that most CFOs, for example, would say, okay, if I advertise and spend $1 million, I'll get this amount of money back from people buying the product. So it was a leap of faith for McKeel Haggerty to decide to market his business in this way. But it turns out it was a fabulous decision because now they have millions of fans. And people say, okay, I need to insure my car. I'm going to go to Haggerty, even if they're a little bit more expensive to do business with, because I'm already a fan, because they're telling these stories, because they've built an overall story about the world of classic cars, where it's a fun place to be. You want to be a part of it. Here are some ways that you can do so. I love that story because people will often say to me, oh, but a B2B company can't have fans, or a dentist can't have fans, or, you name it. There's the excuse out there that says, oh, I can't do this building fans is only for a sports team, or building fans is only for a consumer product like Apple. But no, here's a product, auto insurance, that everybody hates, and a company that has cultivated millions of fans around them.
Yeah. No, it's a great story. It's a great story. Now, when we chatted 3 years ago, you had some very strong opinions about social media. And it was brilliant. It was a brilliant conversation. We always use your line in any of our sizzle reels or advertising where you said Facebook was the biggest threat to humanity since the atomic weapon, right? And since that, we've always had great discussions about that. But since which time there's been another technological advancement, which is the biggest I've seen in my lifetime, and that's generative AI. So what are your thoughts on this, David? Is it more or less dangerous than Facebook? And what's it going to do to storytelling? What's it going to do to that human spark, that human emotional story recollection? Give me your thoughts on that.
I still think that that the various social networks, and it's not the social networks, the entire social network. It's the AI-driven algorithm that drives what people will see in that social network that I think is the danger to humanity. And so we'll revisit this a little bit, and I'll talk about Gen AI. So the reason that 3 years ago we talked about this, and I still have this belief, is that when there's an artificial intelligence generated algorithm that's tuned to reward making more money for a social networking company, whether that's X or Meta, who owns Instagram and Facebook, among others, or Alphabet that owns Google and YouTube. These companies are publicly traded. Well, X no longer, but the other companies are publicly traded, and they have investors that demand a return. And therefore, those companies need to make as much money as possible. And therefore, those companies have recognized that when you're angry, you stay on a platform longer. When you stay on a platform longer, they can show you more ads. And so in many ways, the algorithms are tuned for polarization. They're tuned to show you things that in some ways they think may, and it depends on the person, but as an overarching strategy, those algorithms want to show you something that will get you to click on more things like that, and get you to click on more things like that. And generally, when they make you angry, you generally click more. So what that does is it makes conspiracy theories more likely to spread than they would otherwise. It makes it more likely that people spread hatred than they might otherwise. And so, therefore, I do think these are still among the most destructive technologies ever invented. And it's the AI algorithms behind them that's the dangerous part. The social network itself, if it didn't have that AI behind it, would not be as dangerous as it is with that AI, especially since the average person gets the majority of their news through social networks. They're not going to mainstream media, they're going to social networks. Now, if we're talking about artificial intelligence, I see there being two enormous different types of how people use generative artificial intelligence, especially when it comes to creating content. So we as marketers love to create content, and I've seen so many marketers go to one of the generative AI large language models like ChatGPT, for example, or a Claude, or one of the ones from Google, whatever it might be, and say, write me a blog post about storytelling, or whatever they want to write a blog post about. And in my opinion, that kind of, it creates pollution. It's generative of other people's work. Whereas I do think that those programs, those systems like, for example, ChatGPT, if you're using your own data as the input, can be remarkably interesting. And I always like to to share with people a really simple way to understand generative AI. And it's AI, this AI is simply data times math, data times math. So the math comes from the company. For OpenAI is the company behind ChatGPT. So it's OpenAI's math, or it's Google's math. Anthropic is the company behind Claude. So it's Anthropic's math. The data that goes into that calculation is typically what most people use: public internet data. And if you're just asking a question, that's fine. For example, I'm going to be going to Rome next week. What can I do on a one day in Rome that I'm free on a business trip? It gives me some great suggestions. That's a great way to use Gen AI with public internet data. But I don't like the idea of using Gen AI to create content for marketers, to create storytelling, because it's simply derivative of other work. But I do think it's cool to use generative AI as a way to repurpose content or enhance it that you create. And I'll give you an example. When I write a blog post, well, I'll even back up. You could, and perhaps already are, taking the audio of our discussion, running that through a transcription engine, so that's artificial intelligence, and getting a transcript of our discussion. Then you could say to ChatGPT or another model, you could say, please summarize this discussion between Matt and David and give us the most important points. Then those most important points, each of those could become a social post, a tweet, or a LinkedIn post or whatever. That's a really cool use of Gen AI with our own data. Now, to take that even further, I created my own bot, my own Gen AI bot. My name is David Meerman Scott. I call my bot David Meerman Bot. And I love this. I love this thing because I have 20 years of blog posts that I've written since 2004. It's like 1,600 or so, I don't remember the exact number, blog posts. I dumped all of those into a database, and then I dumped every word of 6 of my books into that same database. It's over 6 million words in total, but every word I wrote, every single word I wrote. And so then I can query my own brain. How cool is that? I can say to myself, write a blog post about the important aspects of storytelling during the Apollo Lunar Program, and it will, but it's using my research, my words, my ideas, not public internet data. So there's some really awesome ways that we can be using generative AI as marketers. I threw up an example on my blog just a couple minutes before we jumped on this call. I was walking through my local shopping mall around lunchtime yesterday, and I saw in the hallway of the mall, not in a store, but in the hallway of the shopping mall, there was a piano dealer, and the piano dealer had like 6 or 8 pianos, and on every single piano there was a sign that said, "Please do not play without permission." Let me repeat that. Please do not play without permission. And I thought to myself, what a silly way to market pianos, to have a big old sign on every single one saying, please don't play without permission. So I went to ChatGPT and I gave a pretty elaborate prompt, something like, you are a strategic marketer at a company that's marketing pianos. You've bought space in a mall where you're going to display your pianos. One of your colleagues is worried that random people will play the piano, people who are not interested in wanting to buy a piano. So they created a sign that says, please do not play without permission. You think that's a little harsh. Please suggest alternative ways that you could prevent random people from playing the piano while encouraging those who might want to buy to do so. And it gave me 6 or 8 amazing suggestions for what you might do, what a sign might be, or a sign-up form or whatever, and or have certain times that anyone can come and play. It was a great way of using Gen AI. It's a really long answer to a simple question, I know, Matt.
But here's and I'm conscious of time, so I want you to give me a yes or no on this one. Can generative AI, ever replace humans in the art of storytelling?
I think yes, but will those stories be interesting and effective? The way I look, I know you wanted a one-word answer. The way I look at it is, in storytelling, the sharp edges are fascinating. The surprising twists and turns are fascinating. I think it'll be a long time before generative AI is nothing more than the edges roughed down into something smooth.
So let's put that to the test. This is our new feature in this season, TGI Storytime. So in less than 5 minutes, please retell a story that had a profound influence on your life. A story that you either saw a movie, you read it in a book, it was a poem, it was a song, it could have been something your grandmother said to you when you were 5 years old. So share with our listeners your TGI Storytime. TGI Storytime.
So I've been a marketer almost all of my career. And the early part of my career, I followed the typical marketing rules that I read in books. It was, the 4 Ps: price, promotion, product placement, I think they are. Typical stuff. You had to spend money on ads and all that. And in the back of my mind, I kept thinking there has to be something different. So I read this book by Seth Godin, and it's called Purple Cow. And it originally came out in 2005. It was a long time ago. And no, I'm sorry, it was the 1990s, I think it came out. But anyway, it came out a long time ago. And I was a young marketer, and I'm like, wow, this is fascinating. And it was a real simple premise to the book. It said, if you want to stand out, don't do what everybody else does. Do something different. If you want to stand out, don't be a black and white cow like every other cow out there. Become a purple cow. And it blew my mind because, number one, Seth himself is a great storyteller, but it blew my mind that marketing was more than what the boring old traditional marketers were saying what it was. And so I learned a ton from that book. And that also, Seth as a writer and Seth as an author gave me permission to say what I truly think. And I started to that's when I started my blog around that time. That's when I started to think about, I should go out on my own, which I did, rather than work at companies. That was around the time that I decided maybe I should write a book. And it was also around the time that I started to talk about ideas like buyer personas, understanding your buyers, not just talking about your products and services, the idea of storytelling that we've been talking about a lot today. And it really all came from that book. And I'm fortunate that in the years since, Seth and I have become friends and colleagues and have shared ideas many times and been on Zoom calls many times. So I find that to be I find that to be a wonderful experience to have, number one, looked up to him greatly and how he blew my mind about what marketing can be. And I've become friends with him. But I've used those ideas, and it gave me the permission to put my own radical ideas and stories out into the world.
The Purple Cow.
The Purple Cow.
I wonder if Ridley Scott will pick that one up. We'll
Nice.
have to see. We'll have to see. Right, so we're going to finish with our quick fire TGI to go. Are you ready, David? You know the story.
I'm ready. Hit me up, Matt.
TGI to go. Here's a good one. Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg?
I'll go with Musk.
Ooh. Is that because after what you said in Facebook about Facebook in the last episode that we recorded, it might be a bit risky to sit down with Mark?
Primarily because what he's doing with SpaceX is so radical and so interesting, and he is ferrying astronauts around. NASA couldn't do it in other ways. It's Elon Musk's SpaceX that's doing it.
Okay, you had to sit down and read a book this evening, and you're presented with two authors, Jane Austen or J.K. Rowling, two British female magnificent authors. which one would you choose?
I'm going to go with Jane Austen. In this case, I have not read Jane Austen, I think, in a really, really long time. So I would go with that route.
Sense and Sensibility is what my wife's favorite all-time novel is.
Nice.
Okay, and along with reading that book, you could have a meal. Would you have clam chowder, given you're in the Boston area, or miso soup?
Clam chowder, because it's a meal in itself. Miso soup is a side dish. I would go. I lived in Japan for 7 years and my wife's Japanese. I've had a lot of miso soup in my life.
That's good. You see, that's Larissa's research to get the balance on those questions.
Yeah, there you
well
go.
Done, Larissa.
There you go. Well done, Larissa.
Now, you just did the big track up from the Quebec border down to the border with Massachusetts. So on your next one, and I'm sure you're thinking about where it could be, would it be potentially Hawaii or Tahiti?
Oh, interesting. I'm going to go with Tahiti. I've never been there. I have a weird thing. I want to go to as many countries as I can in my lifetime. I've been to 107 countries, all 7 continents, all 50 states so far. I have not been to Tahiti.
Wow, there we go. And we talked about storytelling. We talked about the many books you've read, and we've talked about the many books, that you've written as well. Do you prefer writing or reading, consuming or creating there, David?
They're such utterly different things. And I think the more I read, the better a writer I am. That's a tough call. But ultimately, I like being creative, so I'll go with writing.
Yeah. But I think that's right. The more you read, the more you need to write. It's almost like the fuel in many instances, particularly if you read something that has a profound impact on you, like The Purple Cow.
Yes.
That was the motivation that took you into writing. So
yeah, it was the motivation that got me to write marketing books, that's for sure, yeah.
Right, so I just want to say thank you, David. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you again today. It's always fascinating. I always get a huge amount out of it. Have you got any last message for our listeners before we meet again?
I do. Marketing and storytelling should be fun. If it's not, you have to make it fun.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I love the definition that I've read several times about marketing, and I think it came from the Ogilvy, was marketing is intelligence having fun.
Interesting. I haven't heard that one. That's a great one.
Cool. Well, thank you very much again, David. It's been a pleasure having you on The Great Indoors today, and I look forward to speaking to you very soon.
Sounds good, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
Well, there we go. That's another wrap for this episode of The Great Indoors, episode number 2. And a huge thank you to David for sharing his invaluable insights as ever. Great to have you back on the show, David. Also, don't forget to check out David's work and also watch the movie Fly Me to the Moon. There's your weekend recommendation for you right there. Now, for all of the updates on the podcast, on this season, and on previous episodes, please visit us at amdocs.com/The Great Indoors. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time as we continue exploring the human side of the digital age. I'm Matthew Roberts from Amdocs in Toronto, and have a great day wherever you are.